You've discovered the Technoprogressive Hub. Join us to fight for a high-tech and radically democratic future. Today on Technoprogressive Hub, Matteo and I are going to talk about the Pro-Human AI Declaration, which was just put out by a very, very diverse coalition. You can find it at humanstatement.org, but we're going to talk about it in terms of whether it is a technoprogressive document or represents what kinds of technoprogressive ideas might be present in it. The fact that it was organized, this document and the coalition behind it, which again is a very impressive coalition, was organized by Max Tegmark and the Future of Life Institute, which I do not consider at all to be a Luddite operation. I consider it to be a technoprogressive operation. It's been funded by the AI folks in the past, so it's come under the suspicion that it is too much in AI's pocket, actually, and has good ties with a lot of AI industry types. But they brought together Christian conservatives, Steve Bannon, people from the anti-tech wing of the New Right, along with Randy Weingarten, Ralph Nader, a lot of progressive nonprofits and unions. And the AFL-CIO actually wrote a coda of its own, a concurring opinion to the overall declaration, but offering 10 more things that they thought could be adopted that would help workers with AI. So I think it's an extremely important document and a signal of the technology fights that are shaping up for 2026, 2028. So Matteo and I are going to talk about it in some detail today. Welcome, Matteo.
Thanks, James. Yeah, it's good to be on. And I agree. This is it's an interesting document in general, and also the extremely large coalition that was put together in order to achieve it is also quite remarkable to me. I know in the Verge piece about it recently, they had noted that it's one of the largest coalitions on any document in recent memory, I think. And I know that when I was reading it, most of the reading of it was actually the names of the organizations and scholars and organizers. Something like when I was listening to the article, 2/3 of the time was just the time for the for the organizations on there. So
Yeah,
I was
just
really
to
impressed
just
and
the ones at the top of the
a
ones at
bit
the top.
perplexed.
The ones at the top of the list: Institute for Family Studies, which is a conservative group, I think, AFL-CIO, Congress of Christian Leaders, American Federation of Teachers, Interfaith Forum, SAG-AFTRA, Progressive Democrats, the Blessed Mother Mary Foundation. I mean, come on, it's bizarre. It's a bizarre coalition, but it represents the moment, which is that there are people on the right who hate tech as well. And what it reminds me of, and gives me flashbacks of, is that in the 2000s, when I was doing the World Transhumanist Association stuff, there was a coalition that had formed on in the anti-enhancement side. There was the President's Council on Bioethics, who represented some prominent conservative bioethicists who had written against transhumanism and enhancement. And they got together with leftists and environmentalists around an explicitly anti-enhancement, kind of Luddite, anti-biotech coalition. And I worried when I saw this that this was going to be the same kind of thing. We're going to make it a lot harder to make a technoprogressive case. But as I said, I think as we go through it, we'll see that there's actually quite a bit here for technoprogressives to like, and then other things for us to quibble and interrogate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
So
agree.
go ahead.
I agree. There's quite a bit in here that when I read it on its face, it makes sense. I think it sounds like progressive, and in general, it's hard to disagree with a lot of these statements. Not all of them, of course, but a lot of them on their face, I agree with. I wonder, as we dig into the coalition and really what these things mean in practice, if we really do agree with the statements when we actually go about trying to do these things in real life.
Right.
And so, yeah, let's go through maybe the statements themselves and think about them, and then we can maybe interrogate them, yeah, as you're saying.
Well, first, I wanted to read the preamble that if you click to whether you want to endorse this, it takes you to another website where you can enter your information. And the preamble at the top of that website says, not anti-tech, pro-human. We believe in progress and innovation, not just the expense at the expense of our dignity, our communities, or our families. So we believe in the progress and innovation, but not at the expense of these other things. True innovation should empower us, not replace us. That's why we're calling to regulate AI with the same common sense safety standards that we have for every other powerful technology. No, so that framing right there, that is technoprogressive, right? We can fit within that framing. So then the question, as you say, is, well, okay, what are you actually for?
Right. Yeah, there's a lot there. I think I agree with it in broad strokes. And just like a lot of other documents related to this, like Pause AI, a lot of it makes sense on its face. And it's in itself rather techno-progressive. It's just a matter of often when we begin to build these things, what will that really mean? And not just whether it's achievable. Uh, I think those are two separate questions. Like, can we actually do it? Is it feasible? What kind of politics will we need? That's one kind of question. But I think the other one is, can a coalition, I mean, a much smaller coalition than this one, even coalitions that are of the same political stripe, stay together, let alone ones that are kind of really broad, almost to all corners of the political, you know, the four quadrants of the when you do I'm reminded of those like questionnaires where you get the four quadrants of your political views, and they'll say something like, do you believe that the government should center human flourishing, right? And almost everybody's going to say yes. But what is human flourishing? How would we achieve it? Almost everyone's going to disagree.
Yeah.
So I
Well,
think,
this
yeah, let's
is
go through it and then we can think about that.
I like, by the way, the idea of a two-axis political map is central to the way I think about things and was part of Citizen Cyborg. And if you think about it that way, I think what is so remarkable about this is that the far right is in one corner of that map and the progressive left is in another corner. And
Hmm.
it's quite a bit of political space between them. But the thing that unites these two is that the far right, the cultural conservatives in this case, who are not in the pocket of big tech. The cultural conservatives want to regulate it for cultural conservative reasons, and the leftists want to regulate it for leftist reasons, and that brings them together around this topic. So the five pillars that they promote here: keeping humans in charge, avoiding concentrations of power, protecting the human experience, human agency and liberty, and responsibility and accountability for AI companies. So just on the top of that, my first reaction is that the keeping human beings in charge seems to be predicated partly on the idea of we want to shift AI from being automation to being extension labor extenders, on the theory that this is a pro-employment, a pro-human and pro-employment way to do things, which
Hmm.
I mean, I don't think we should disagree. I don't think one should disagree with that. Except I don't think that that protects employment because inevitably, if one person's doing the work of 10, you're going to see some effect on employment, right?
That's true. I am, yeah, definitely most that's the one that first one is, the kind of foundation of all the others. And it's also the most difficult to really grasp what it actually means in real terms, but like how humans stay in charge. I think that most humans are already not in charge. So, almost everybody on the planet is not in charge right now. And these companies that are concentrating power, as you know, the principles also note, are already running the world.
Yeah.
And so it does raise the question, I think, for me immediately, of what they mean by humans. And I think that's where the declaration would break down in practice quite quickly. Um, but like on its face, I agree that huge concentrations of power, monopolies, oligopolies, price. Before we were worried about price fixing and other things. Now we're worried about, the survival of humanity and killer robots, autonomous, you know, what's it called? Super intelligence having access to the nuclear football and all that stuff. That's really the existential risk that they're worried about with autonomous weaponry. And I agree that concentrations of power make many of these problems worse, as they are already making these problems worse. We already have only a few nuclear powers, and it is already a major existential risk to society. It's hard to disagree that extreme concentrations of wealth and power are just not in the interest of human flourishing.
Well, one of the interesting things about FLI bringing this group together is that FLI was originally funded by some of these tech titans,
Hmm.
but especially after the failed coup at OpenAI against Sam Altman, and the beginning of explicit AI tech titan alignment with the Trump administration and opposition to efforts at AI regulation, FLI started to back pieces of AI regulation that the big tech titans were opposed to. And I think they now see and understand correctly that the capitalist incentives behind the big tech titans are directly opposed to AI safety of the kind that they want. And that's
Hmm.
one of the reasons why they explicitly excluded AI business industry interests and spokespeople from the meeting that organized this statement. So, do you want to read the? Should we read the first section, the "Keeping Humans in Charge" section?
Sure.
Okay, so the first part under that is human control is non-negotiable. Humanity must remain in control. Humans should choose how and whether to delegate decisions to AI systems. Oh, yay or nay?
Well, it's
Yeah, yeah. This is we've got the Peter Thiel problem. It's like, should humanity survive? And it's like, well,
well, that's an
I mean,
interesting.
well, what do you mean by humanity, really? I mean,
I agree that we want a democratic process in control of how AI is developed. But I think the problem, again, that I keep running into when I read these things is I agree. When I'm understanding from my perspective or the techno-progressive perspective, when I think of humanity, I'm thinking of a democratic, socialized process. You know, I imagine something like, you know, as we've talked about before, like cosmopolitan socialism, an actual, UN, something functioning that can actually make decisions that would really reflect humanity and could actually, not every single person's view, but that most people would say is representative of us. But when you hear other people, like the CEOs of many tech companies, talk about humanity, as they do constantly, including Sam Altman and Elon Musk and others that are listed somewhat as enemies in this declaration, they constantly talk about humanity, human values, human dignity, all this stuff. And you're like, well, who is this humanity? It's
right.
not every human, right? I mean,
So,
it's
so, so let's
some
put it.
humans have more value than others to you, right? So what do we mean by humanity?
So
Is it a democratic process or not?
the two footnotes I would put on this one is yes, the humanity part is ill-defined. It's a place where we think you should not be careless because 3 generations from now, our descendants could be living as virtual bodies in Pokemon form in a cloud server in Jupiter. and consider themselves children of humanity and part of the human family. And that's not what anybody here is thinking about yet. So
Yeah,
what
there is that
exactly?
too.
Yeah, what exactly is humanity here? And what does it mean for humans to choose? I mean, for Elon Musk to make a choice, he's human. What does it mean for humanity as a whole to choose? Well, that would have been nice if you'd specified what exactly that means. But we'll get to some of their political thoughts in a second. Okay, the second part is meaningful human control. Humans should have authority and capacity to guide, understand, prescribe, and override AI systems. Again, okay, but
I think they're talking really when people usually say this, like keep a human in the loop, right?
yeah.
I was just watching the hearings about the bombings in Iran, and they were talking about how, who's that guy, the head of like the NATO fleet or whatever. He
Mm-hmm.
was testifying and he was like, we have all these robust processes and we have to, always go back and, reconsider things when there's these tragedies and all that stuff. And so really, whenever we say something like humanity having it being in the loop, it's really often talking about something like an institution, in this case, NATO. It could be the US Army, so that we imagine the Joint Chiefs of Staff and lieutenants and other people who are on the ground, that the people on the ground, the officers who are on the ground in whatever wherever are talking to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and there's some kind of process that is relatively transparent, and there's people who have to sign off on it and be accountable to it, etc. Now, that doesn't usually always work out the way it sounds, and there's all kinds of problems with it. But, people will argue that if we train an AI based on how these systems are currently run, it would make an unaccountable system even less accountable. And as they note later on in the declaration, it would allow a kind of, well, it's not us, it's the computers that made that blew up this school, right? That this atrocity is not our fault.
Right.
Um,
Well,
which
we're going to get to
is
that. Let's
obviously
let's
which is obviously not acceptable, but I think that's what they really mean, like that humanity in the loop, humanity overriding the system is something like the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the lieutenants. It's not really like humanity as a whole. It's
well,
like
I think
some humans who are assigned.
this is a key part of their document because they do get very explicit about what kind of liability, corporate and personal liability they want, and that the machines should never be held liable. Which I think we all agree, machines should not be held liable at this
Right.
moment.
That
But
makes
they
sense.
also kind of allied the question of whether machines ever could be held liable. That's an important part of the question. But when I think about the humans in the loop question, I think about when I first started to learn Qualtrics, which is a piece of survey software. And in order to prevent spam, Outlook had a feature that if you were trying to send out 2,000 surveys, you had to click yes each time so that they could suppress spam. And I'm sure that there were many ways that spammers got around that with Outlook. But there was just a piece of software that I could download that when I was sending out 2,000 surveys, it would automatically click yes for every one of them as it went through. And it would take a little bit longer because it had to go through that cycle. But it's like whenever I think about keeping humans in the loop, it's like, okay, Claude, Dario's okay with Claude lining up 50 targeting targets for Iran bombers. He just doesn't want Claude pushing the button. It's like, okay, well,
Yeah,
that is the least consequential decision at that point, whether you
that's
push the
true.
button or not. Yeah.
That's a good point. I mean, we can imagine it almost sounds like a dark comedy, but I think it's really not. You can imagine generals, people sitting around and they're trying to figure out what to target, and they're supposed to be determining where they need to bomb, and what their strategic locations are, and they're responsible. They have to hit the button, but right before they hit the button, they ask ChatGPT what the best targets are. and how they should allocate their resources. And, it's some, more advanced model than what we have on our smartphones, but it really takes in all this military data and like feeds it back to them and is like, we think you should target this. And they're like, well, I mean, if that's what the AI says, okay, humans are in the loop. Hit the
Right.
button.
Which we see every time an automated decision making system is implemented is that
It's been like
way
that for
be- way before way before the evidence is there, people start to trust it as smarter than them, and eventually it will be smarter than them. And sometimes it starts out smarter than them, but when it's not, you're still trusting it when you shouldn't. Okay, well, the next piece of the keeping humans in charge is explicit about what human control means in relationship to the concept of superintelligence. So I'm just going to read these together, then we can talk about the superintelligence piece of it. No superintelligence race. Development of superintelligence should be prohibited until there's a broad scientific consensus that it can be done safely and controllably, and there's strong public buy-in. Off
Mhm.
switch. Powerful AI systems must have mechanisms that allow human operators to promptly shut them down. No reckless architectures. AI systems must not be designed so that they can self replicate, autonomously self improve, resist shutdown, or control weapons of mass destruction. Independent oversight. Highly autonomous AA systems where controllability is not obvious require pre development review and independent oversight, genuine authority to understand, prohibit, override, not industry self regulation. And finally, capability honesty. AI companies must provide clear, accurate, and honest representations of their systems' capabilities and limitations. So they're saying we believe that there's going to be superintelligence. We think they should not be designed recklessly. They should be designed with government oversight. The government should be able to tell companies to turn them off. Companies should not be allowed to lie about what they're doing. And we don't want there eventually to be forms of superintelligence that can self-replicate or act like a living being trying to escape from us.
Yeah.
I'm fine with most of that. Where do you have qualms?
Well, let me work backward for a second here. So, capability honesty, like I agree that AI companies, should provide clear, accurate, and honest representations of their systems' capabilities and limitations. And not only because of, X risk or something, but also just from, to avoid hype, overinflation of stocks, kind of manipulating the public, selling narratives. There's all kinds of other reasons why this is a good idea. How we would achieve it, I'm not quite sure, but on its face, I agree that any company really, but you know, this hyper concentration of capital, I think, makes this problem a bit worse than, say, exaggerating what, you know, a salt can do. You see like this crystal salt can improve your health. Okay, that's probably not true, but it's just one small thing. This toothpaste can get rid of cavities that are already there. Not true, right? But
Right.
they can make,
This
companies make these weird claims all the time and they create hype cycles.
this isn't clinical drug overview. This is bioweapons manufacture overview.
Yeah, like the kind of things that you can do with AI is a lot more than just you're going to get snake oil, right? That's been a problem in capitalism and especially has accelerated in as we've moved more and more toward consumer capitalism. There's been these hype cycles and companies put out these PR campaigns that make their products seem more powerful when they want to pump stocks in a particular way, or they seem less powerful when they don't want to be regulated in a particular way. And I think those are all big problems that should be solved. And I 100% agree with it. And even more so with AI because of the stakes and the way that not only in X risk, but like I'm saying, the way that it concentrates more and more capital and wealth based on overinflating in some areas where they have capabilities and underinflating what they can do in other areas so they don't get regulated in a particular way. I think that's all not very good for society. But it becomes difficult to know here what superintelligence is. I have no idea how we will know what that means, when we will know that we've achieved it. It's
Okay,
like, I think, one of those
they
things
give
where we're
us
only going to know with hindsight, right?
they give us a clue here because of the specification, no reckless architectures. So they say self-replicate,
Yeah,
autonomously self-improve, and resist shutdown. So any behavior where it thinks that its existence is more important than what it's being told, basically. But
is
it
super.
also says then control weapons of mass destruction. So it's not the reckless architecture isn't just whether it has agentic um, features that we are worried about, but also what it's going to be used to do. So weapons of mass destruction, I'm sure they could have added many things there that they didn't want it to do, but weapons of mass destruction just don't connect it in any way to weapons of mass destruction, which we know it's going to be. There's going to be AI connected to
Yeah, it's going
our
to be Sky.
nuclear defense and bioweapons defense and so forth. Anyway, I do like those three: self-replicate, autonomously self-improve, and resist shutdown. I think that those are good benchmarks. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that in the current iteration of our tech economy, as it's controlled by, in general, pretty much totally unaccountable companies, and especially in league with far-right governments like we have in the US now and in other places, it's quite dangerous. I I know that a lot of people advocate for recursive self-improvement and self-replication, especially in things like, space colonization and whatnot, which I don't know, it's not really a present day problem.
Well,
It's kind
we've already got recursive self-improvement. I mean, it's already happening. Like 90% of Claude's code was written by Claude. So
yeah, I mean, I think they're thinking of the singularity and stuff.
yeah.
And, what did like Kurzweil say? Like, he's talking about, like, at a certain point, if the rate of doubling now is like 18 months, like, if we have super exponentiality, then eventually, more will be done in one day than all previous technology combined or something. And it will go on this curve, that is, you know, I don't know. It's just like this hyper curve. But I don't know that that will actually occur. And it doesn't have to occur for it to be uh, problematic. But yes, I think it makes, again, you read the language and it makes sense. We want to have it prohibited until there's a scientific consensus that it can be safe. I mean, it's hard to disagree with that. We don't want it unsafe, right? Now, how we would determine and who would determine it would be safe is hard to it's hard to understand how that will happen in our present political economy, right? Like, people in pause AI and other areas, like, they have good, benchmarks for how we can determine safety and how we can do testing and, red teaming and stuff like that. How it will actually work when these companies not only are not being regulated by, they weren't even being really regulated by liberal governments. Now we have governments that are, you know, quite accelerationist in many ways. And the Trump administration working directly with OpenAI to develop autonomous weaponry now is not going to regulate them. We would need a kind of, I think, supranational body, which is what is suggested
Yeah. Okay,
by
well, let's
Pause
get to
AI.
that. Let's get to that. But okay, so just on this section, I think you and I generally agree that the human keeping humans in control is a good idea, and that they're thinking about it in the right direction. But we have questions around humanity, and we have questions around superintelligence because we think
Yeah.
that those could be defined a lot
This
better.
off switch, though, that's an interesting one that I think it, many people have brought this up. I think I saw, Neil deGrasse Tyson's like, we could just pull a plug, and like, I can just shoot the machine or whatever. I think he said something along those lines. And I don't know if that's really how that would really work. I mean, we'd have to turn off the whole internet, or like, we'd have to shut down power. And do all kinds of things that would be like catastrophic to the economy. I don't know
I
how
think there are a
you
couple
actually.
dozen. I think there are a couple dozen countries that have internet off switches where they can centrally shut down external internet access. Whether that would actually work in this scenario, like if you remember Stuxnet, Stuxnet was an international virus cooked up by Israel and the United States that was infected millions of computers around the world. But its principal purpose was that when it got into one lab in Iran, it was supposed to fuck up one machine, and it successfully did that and destroyed centrifuges in Iranian nuclear production. So you can imagine that, if there was a malicious AI that was spreading itself around the world, and you say, "Oh my God, it's spreading itself around the world. We're going to shut down our access to the internet." It wouldn't do anything unless you shut down the entire internet. I mean, which is also a possibility, but as you say, just shutting down access to the internet probably wouldn't work. You would have to shut
And
down the
we
whole
could shut
thing.
down all data centers, for instance.
Yeah,
Right. Like that, I think they point out in Pause AI that like a lot of this infrastructure is already fairly centralized. It's not like it's, the way it's portrayed in movies, right? Like, oh, it's just like everywhere and every computer and whatever. Like the internet is just this amorphous thing. Like we know that's not the case, right? It's actually physical buildings that are very large. They require an enormous amount of capital, and there are only a few thousand of them in the world.
and specific
All need to
cables.
be, and there's specific cables they could feasibly be shut down. The only thing though is that it would be devastating to the economy to
Yeah,
shut them down. So it would be something that,
transportation, medicine. Yeah,
yeah, it would be a huge problem. I mean, unless we were to re-engineer the entire way that these structures work,
right.
which would be very expensive. I'm not against it per se. I don't know how we could do it without having control that exceeds. We can't even do it at the national level for our, American tech companies, which of course would be alongside China. US and China are the most important because they develop the most AI, they have the most data centers. But we can't even do it here, let alone doing it everywhere on Earth.
Right.
It would be, I think, very difficult, and we would have to have a kind of global governance that we don't currently have.
Well, yeah, the bigger the political authority that you need to do something, the longer and harder it's going to do. And I think one of the problems here is that if we're actually thinking about a hard takeoff scenario where AI, so it starts on Monday, weird stuff starts happening, you get the million emails in your inbox, and by Wednesday, everyone's aware there's a problem and you have to figure out what to do. And by then, it's usually in those scenarios, it's usually too late. So I just don't see, a transnational or even a national action happening quickly enough. But it could be that all relies on hard takeoff, the speed. So it could be that it's much slower and more piecemeal. But let's talk about the next piece because it relates to your concerns about the concentration of capital and how and the fact that they did not want tech moguls at their meeting for this
Mhm.
for this statement. So they say here, avoiding concentration of power. No AI monopolies. All AI monopolies that concentrate power, stifle innovation, and imperil entrepreneurship must be avoided. So they're coming out strong in defense of Lena Khan, the antitrust movement, Cory
Mhm.
Doctorow's kind of analysis, and so forth, which is fantastic. Shared prosperity, the benefits and economic prosperity created by AI should be shared broadly. Excellent. Egalitarianism right up front.
Sure.
No corporate welfare. AI corporations should be exempted from regulatory or should not be exempted from regulatory oversight or receive government bailouts. Government bailouts, sometimes government bailouts are useful, but they should definitely not be exempted from regulatory oversight.
Sure.
Okay. Genuine value creation. AI development should prioritize solving real problems and creating authentic value. Okay. Does that mean we don't get any art? I mean, what exactly is what's the content there?
Mhm.
Democratic authority over major transitions, decisions about AI's role in transforming work, society, and civic life require democratic support, not unilateral corporate or government decree. Love where you're headed with that. Love to hear more detail there. Avoid societal lock in. AI development must not severely limit humanity's future options or reversibly limit our agency over our future. That
Yeah.
one needs a lot of unpacking.
Yeah, this second one is the one I agree with the most. I think it's straight up socialist.
Yeah.
I think if we were to write it ourselves, I would 100% agree with what they're saying because I would also know what we mean by it. But I think it's the hardest to achieve. And instead of the first one being the first set of principles being the kind of fulcrum, I think this is the fulcrum. If we can't control these corporations, and if we can't overcome the tendencies toward fascism in various governments that are in league with these corporations, then I think we have no chance whatsoever of achieving anything else.
Yeah.
So, yeah, controlling these are the most powerful corporations on earth. The US is obviously the largest empire, and Matt has a massive incentive to accelerate these technologies with the assumption that it's going to benefit them. No, that may not be true. We don't really know. And of course, they assume they can keep it under their control. So they think that's going to be, yes, they would probably agree. We want it under human control, under the human control of the people who run these corporations and the people in the government who are our allies. Okay, that's a big assumption. I don't know if that is exactly what would happen. But if we want to actually achieve what the spirit of this declaration is, or at least what I think is the spirit, it's what it sounds like the spirit is, which is that it's humanity more generally, more universally, then the second part is the most important. We have to figure out how we can build something, some kind of build an infrastructure for controlling corporations, which has only been marginally successful in the last few hundred years. And now that value um, production, extraction, I don't know, they're kind of the same thing. So now that that's concentrated ever more in a smaller and smaller group of companies that are part of the tech economy. I mean, the almost all of the companies in the S&P 500 top 10 are tech companies that are heavily invested in AI. And if we say like, let's pause, let's slow down, like the economy is going to collapse, right?
Yeah.
Unless we restructure it. Now, it won't inevitably collapse. Like, of course, we can run the economy without AI companies, but as it's presently structured, it's massively over leveraged in the direction of, basically unlimited investment in AI. And maybe that will cause a bubble. Maybe it won't. I don't know. There's a lot of debate about that. But in any
I
case, in order to change that situation, we would have to rein in the power, corporate power in an unprecedented way, something that has really escaped us, especially in neoliberalism. But I
well,
totally
th-
agree with doing it.
this is the a point where we got to in my conversation with David Shapiro yesterday, which you'll hopefully have heard by now. Um, but that okay, you're if you want to democratize economic decision making, and you recognize that there's been this super concentration of wealth and power and corporate ownership, um, the antitrust approach is one way you could do that. But there's two other options here. One is to say we want public ownership, and Shapiro is interesting because he has been talking about sovereign wealth funds as a way to achieve some of the goals like UBI. But we could democratize ownership by something like the Meidner Plan, by saying over a period of the next decade or 2 decades, we're going to gradually turn over ownership of privately owned firms that are still competing in a private market, but turn over ownership of those firms to the public, either through municipal or state or federal or worker owned plans of some kind of socialization of wealth. That's one way. And another way is to say, okay, this is a monopoly, and we think it's okay that there's a monopoly here. That's what we did with electricity. It's what we do with water. It's what we do with cable service. We don't
Mhm.
want 500 firms competing to like cable lines in your neighborhood. So we're going to say this one is the monopoly in this area. And because you're a monopoly, you can't be regulated by competition. So you have to be regulated by public oversight. And there's going to be a board that's going to help you make decisions about how much you charge for your services and what kind of services you provide. And that's the rationale for a utility. And I'm always of two or three minds here. It's like, on the one hand, I'd love to go in the Meidner direction where appropriate. And if it's an actual useful monopoly, I'd love to go in the utilities direction. But short of that, and especially with a document where you're getting the far right to agree with the far left, short of that, I think the antitrust approach is the kind of common place where we can agree. It's like, well, let's at least go back to 1900, where free men could compete in a free market.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I think yeah, that is an interesting thing where you have this right left coalition, which I'm always suspicious of. And I actually have no idea how that would really work in practice. Because if, when you read these things, no AI monopolies, shared prosperity, no corporate welfare, genuine wealth creation, democratic authority over transitions, avoiding societal lock-in, this requires a completely different structure than what we have now.
Yeah.
Like, I don't see how it can really work. Like, you can,
Who's going to make AI development prioritize solving real problems and creating authentic value? It's like, is that
yeah.
just, that's like a prayer. I mean, I'm glad they had the Christians there, because then they at least understood what they were saying. We should pray for this. Well, okay, but how would it be accomplished?
I think that it can be accomplished, like
Yeah.
you're saying, by developing a probably a at the largest scale, having not even nationalized, it would have to be internationalized. I guess we've never really done this. Uh, Beyond a few small things, like I don't know, like international agreements do a few things that allow internationalization of problems, not really of resources exactly.
Well, you know what it reminds me of is Xi Jinping has adopted policies in China over the last couple of years to penalize and regulate the amount of resources going into gaming, because
Hmm.
there's a recognition in China that too many young people are addicted to gaming, and too many of their talented engineers were going into gaming and entertainment. And he very explicitly said, "This is a problem. I want more of you making bombs, not butter." And he restricted how many hours kids could play games in China, and they know what people are doing online in general. So I think if you want a society that really says don't do frivolous things with AI and only do important things, it might not look like the kind of society you want.
I think, yeah, that's one model. Somebody has brought this up before when we were talking about the risks of like transhumanism and having like super powerful people everywhere, and what if people could get access to developing weapons of mass destruction at a consumer level, creating bioweapons and stuff, and in general, there's like almost a complete opposite way. There's like a fork in how you would deal with these problems. One is to create like an unprecedented scale of totalitarianism, such that we can control even the thought of creating a weapon. I don't know if that's actually possible, and I think it sounds terrible. That's probably not a world worth living in at all. And on the other hand, you'd have to create a world where nobody is incentivized and would consider to do such a thing. And that would require restructuring society in such a way that people don't feel like you can gain anything through violence and coercion. And so we'd have to be well into post-capitalism, like after the end of war and conflict, effectively the kind of society that anarchists generally imagine. Like you don't need a government because everyone is working together in a way that entropy is minimized to like, near zero, not physical, not like in physics, but like social entropy. And so people don't feel like it's necessary to attack other people and like, lie and steal in order to get ahead because there's not only not an incentive for that, but there's not really a general benefit and people can get what they need through cooperation. And either way, one is extremely dystopian. It's so dystopian that yeah, it's just the stuff of nightmares to imagine preventing people from thinking about doing something destructive, right? That's like the plot of Minority Report, right? Like if a person has the intention to commit a murder, then we need to like put them in those pods that they had in Minority Report because they had the intention. And so we need to like put them in stasis. And on the other hand, it would require restructuring society so thoroughly that, I'm not saying it's not possible. I mean, that sounds like a great society, but I don't know how we would get there, and certainly not in time for dealing with AI problems. I mean, we have to do this in a few years, not like, in, I think this creating a post-capitalist society is going to at least take decades, let alone maybe centuries. So to fully transition to another type of society, I don't think there's just time for that stuff, and so
Well,
really when we think about that second one, we're like, we have to deal with this now with the current structure, right? Like you're saying, we can increase regulation. Maybe we can, I think if we're being very optimistic, go back to like the kinds of regulatory regimes we had in the immediate post-war period, where we had, something like price controls and other things, which were more robust in Europe, of course, but where we had kind of planning boards that determined how healthcare was carried out and how the NHS worked, and they've been increasingly privatized in recent years. So we're kind of going in the wrong direction if we want to achieve number two. But if we could get back to like the 1950s, that level of regulation, and we applied that to technology, then we could probably achieve some of these things. Um, yeah.
okay. We we are at an hour and a half, I think, so far. So we want to finish this. We've got three more sections to go. Let's do it in quick succession. The next section, protecting the human experience, is, I think, the most clearly targeted towards the Christian or cultural conservatives who are there, because it's about kids, and the protection of kids is always, brings out the cultural conservative energies as well as progressives, hopefully. So this says, protecting the human experience, defense of family and community bonds. AI should not supplant the foundational relationships that give life meaning: family, friendship, faith communities, and local connections. So opposition to AI companion bots and things like that, I presume.
Mhm.
Child protection: companies must not be allowed to exploit children or undermine their well-being with AI interactions that create emotional attachment or leverage. So age gating access to certain kinds of AI bots. Right to grow: AI companies should not be allowed to stunt children's physical, mental, or social growth or deprive them of essential experiences for healthy development during critical periods. So, educational or developmental stunting by interaction with AI chatbots, I think, is what they're thinking about there. Um, Pre-deployment safety testing: like drugs, chatbots must undergo pre-deployment testing. We agree in general, but in particular for suicidal ideation, exacerbation of mental health disorders, escalation of acute crisis situations, and other known harms. Bot or not labeling: AI generated content could reasonably be mistaken for human generated, must be clearly labeled as such. I think this is like the GMOs, that, whether you should put GMO labeling on things. I think we could come back about how difficult that would be. But no deceptive identity: AI should clearly and correctly identify itself as artificial, non-human, and not a professional, and it should not claim experiences that it lacks. So it's like smoking warnings on your chatbot interactions. No behavioral addiction: AI should not cause addiction or compulsive use through manipulation, sycophantic validation, or attachment formation. Okay, so my big problems here: what does it mean to be addicted if I use it every hour of the day? but I say I could give it up at any time. Am I addicted? So that's one problem. Um, the generated content should not be mistaken for human generated. It's like, well, okay, if your kid's bot, which is 3 feet tall and shaped like a Pokemon, talks to it all the time, is and it then you ask the kid, is that a human? They say obviously it's not a human, but aren't they going to be treating it as a companion, as something that is a person? So I think there's a couple problems with the way that they're framing things here, but I like the direction in general. The big and just one more thing I would say is that age gating. I have a problem with age gating, and I was feeling this and wondering if I was the only one until a big pushback has started against age gating on the grounds that it would de-identify everybody on the internet. Which again gets
Yeah.
us back to the Chinese case. If you get on the internet, you're supposed to, everyone who's on the internet is supposed to use an ID
In
that
China.
that identifies them to the state. And that's the only way, if we're going to keep kids off of porn sites or whatever, that's the only way to do it, is to make everybody de-identify themselves.
Yeah, well, this is like one of the this is the thing that we've come back to repeatedly in this conversation and in others. Like, I agree with these things a lot in principle.
Yeah.
Like, I have a big problem with a lot of the way deep fakes are used, and especially when they're used of kids and the effects that that can have on them. And certainly things like, Grok allowing CSAM to be produced and kids circulating that around their schools. I can definitely see how that could be traumatic. And not only that, it could lead to suicide. I mean, it could be catastrophic. So in principle, I totally agree. And also I agree that we shouldn't have, kids online, you know, not having friendships and not dating, and instead they are, dating AI, or they think they are, and they can't really form friendships. I
Do
don't
you know
know
the
if how
term
big.
hikikomori?
Hmm.
It's the Japanese phenomenon of shut-ins. They have millions
Right.
of mostly guys, but also women, who just live off their parents into their 30s because of their addictions, usually to social media, to Pokemon, or to anime characters in general.
Yeah, I think these are huge problems. It's kind of like disinformation and other things that people get sucked into, getting red pilled or black pilled or whatever. Lots of problems can arise from these things. And I agree in principle. Like, it's hard to disagree that we should protect children and that children should have the right to grow. And of course, I would also agree, as you said, that there should be pre-deployment testing, and that we should try to mitigate suicidal ideation and the exacerbation of mental health disorders,
Right. This is also riffing
all of
off
that
of
stuff.
the Facebook testimony that they knew about various harms, algorithmic harms to kids from Instagram and Facebook, but didn't do anything about it, or decided to cut corners or whatever. So I think, yeah, as they've said elsewhere in the document, the company should not be allowed to hide that kind of data, but
Right.
also they should be regulated on the basis of it.
I agree with that. And I
Yeah.
think that it makes a lot of sense. And, I don't know about how we would deal with liability in that regard. Like, I know there was that famous case where, ChatGPT helped somebody write their suicide note, and, there were other cases similar to it. And, is that open? I don't actually know in detail like how much OpenAI was aware of these kind of problems and hid them. They are incentivized to do these kinds of things and to have this kind of behavior. And again, that brings us back to point two, that if your business model is to make sure people use the thing as much as possible in as many ways as possible, you know, it's hard. They cannot, of course, self-regulate that. Their entire existence is based on having people use their model more than other models, and having it be as not only as effective as possible, but as, users feeling like this thing is indispensable and I cannot not have it, right? that's like built into the whole way these things are designed. And that is a systems level problem. But I don't know how we would achieve some of these other things. Like, I don't know actually how we would achieve labeling something as bot, even if in principle, we don't want a deep fake where we're having like a presidential debate and there's like a fake president, right? There's like, you think it's, JD Vance, but really it's actually a bot. And, you know, or vice versa, like JD Vance is like somehow, putting out political ads where it's AOC, presumably, who would probably destroy JD Vance in an election, I hope. But puts out like that she's making all these statements that she's not making, and then, you know, then it's like, well, that's a bot, that's not me. And then it becomes like people saw the ad already and not everybody saw the rebuttal, right? And so it creates this, well, there's now fractured reality, and the people who are on JD Vance's side or are kind of on the fence are like, well, is it really a bot? I mean, how do we know? And this creates a bunch of unnecessary debate. But actually solving this problem, I think it's going to be really thorny.
I agree. Well, let me go back to the first item here because there's also something to say there. Defense of family and community bonds. AI should not supplant the foundational relationships that give life meaning, family, friendship, faith communities, and local connections. Okay. Again, is this a prayer or is this a policy recommendation? Because if it's a policy recommendation, I'm very uncomfortable with the government having as a policy the protection of especially faith communities. But in general, saying, oh, we're worried about the family. So we're going to protect you from this technology, which it's like, well, the automobile allowed young people to go on dates to drive-ins where they could get teen pregnant. And did that screw up the family? Yes. I mean, some families are very upset that their kids were having sex in cars out in the middle of fields. Um, should the government have stepped in and said we don't want teens to be able to own cars because they could get teen pregnant? I don't think so. And so whenever the government, it's like the movie rating standards. It's like, should the government step in and say you shouldn't be showing kissing on the screen because that's going to be bad for the family? So I am worried about empowering the state to protect these nebulous things: family, faith,
Yeah.
friendship.
Yeah, I totally agree. I don't trust any government to do this. Certainly not a far right government, but
Yeah.
I've always been of the mind that any indication of family is always the family and never the family members, right? Any talk of kids is always kids, never actual. It's kids as a concept, never kids as individual people. Just like the whole pro-life argument, like it's about life in general, never anybody's actual individual life,
Right. You want to
right?
defend family? How about paid family leave? How about universal health insurance?
Yeah, I mean,
Your
because they're
kid's
talking some,
dying, and what you're worried about is that he didn't get to church.
yeah, well, that's the thing, it's that I think this coalition would completely break down on those questions because we have no universal conception of what any of that means. And what we consider good for kids is not a universal thing. And we don't want the state to determine that, even if, we can say kind of what we disagree with. We disagree with, so many things. Just like I disagree with all kinds of things related to my own kids. And I don't like many things when I encounter them. But then I don't see it as a policy. It's very hard to imagine it being a policy. Like for instance, I don't like that there's all this junk food out there and that there's all this like, when there's all this like really hyper stimulating TV that makes it difficult for them to regulate their emotions, small people to regulate their emotions. But I don't also think that it should be a policy that the government should like ban a studio from making a TV show. I don't
Mm-hmm.
that cannot it has to be some other kind of way that we would have to deal with it some other way. Not we're not going to we can deal with the junk food problem by maybe not, subsidizing it with the farm bill, subsidizing corn so that we have corn syrup and everything. Okay, that's like a thing we can do. But we're not going to go out and say like, well, in order to deal with the problem of kids eating too much sugar, well, why don't we create this, you know, parental training program and you have to become certified in order to make sure that you are trustworthy to determine the diet of your kids and determine what they watch. And, we can have these inspectors come and make sure you're doing that. And, why don't we just like increase CPS 10 times and have people from CPS come and make sure that your kids are watching the right stuff on TV and we can monitor your IP address and see if you're watching, proper child-friendly material. It's like that would be absurd, right?
Right.
So that's not going to work. And I think in many of these cases, you're like, well, yeah, we can broadly agree. We don't want kids, again, like falling in love with chatbots, especially before they've ever fallen in love with a human, because first, it's hard for adults to deal with it, let alone like a 13-year-old. But
What this makes this part about supplanting foundational relationships reminds me of the TV show Humans, which was originally Swedish, and then they made a British version. And in the British version, there's a character John Hurt plays an elderly British man who's been given a robot by the National Health Service to maintain him and before his wife died, his wife. And that robot's now like 10, 15 years old, and the wife is dead. And the robot remembers everything about the relationship that he has had to these two people over 15 years. And so the man values the robot as a constituent part of his family relationship with his wife, because he can talk to the robot about all the things that they experienced together as the three people, as two people and a robot. Um, and when the NHS wants to replace it, I mean, in reality, they could just probably upload the memory to a new robot. But the NHS wants to replace it. He wants to keep the old one because the new one won't have those memories. So I think about that because I think what this AI should not supplant foundational relationships is what if AI complements the relationships that we have? And if there was an AI that could take on some of the responsibilities of the work that my wife does to make sure that my kids have their prescriptions on time, to talk to my daughter every time she's got a hypochondriacal complaint. There could be an AI which could manage some of our family communications in ways that we would feel as a compliment and not a replacement.
sure. I think that's a good point. How we would separate the two, I think in the current environment, it's not really possible to separate those two things, like, harms from benefits. I think in theory, we can separate them not directly, but indirectly through changing the incentives for development, through changing the institutions that design and develop AI and robotics, by having public control, not over the outcomes of what a chatbot or an Android would do, but really over like how we program the models and how they would work and what things we consider to be useful and valuable, which of course are always debatable. We're not actually having those debates. We are having these debates like amongst ourselves, but inside the process of design, this debate's not occurring.
Yeah.
So if we had a meaningful control or power over that design and development process, some of these things would become anachronistic concerns, right? Anachronistic concerns. We would mitigate maybe some of these because we would not be incentivized if we had a kind of if we had public platforms or we had, multi-stakeholder platforms where, some of it is public and some of it is run by cooperatives and some of it is run by regulated companies or, there's many ways we could set it up. And that would change the economic incentives, it would change the cultural and social incentives, and it would probably change the outcomes quite a bit. And so I would advocate for that. But I would not advocate for, directly controlling people's desires in a society where those desires are shaped by their social environment. Like if we don't have a democratic process to try to democratize how the social environment is constructed in the first place, it seems quite cruel and dystopian to then punish people after the fact. Like
So
we
some
have
of the people who were at the table to sign this document and these statements in particular see the rise of LGBT identification among Gen Z as part of a social contagion spread through social media and AI, right? So they would
that sounds
say,
great.
yeah, they would say, if my kid got served LGBT content, that's it pushing and trying to manipulate my kid. And so, the interpretations of what keeping kids free from manipulation could be quite divergent here. But
And we could say that's liberating them, maybe,
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's a different, that depends on whether you're on the left or the right, if you're on the
That's
socially
right.
conservative or socially
I'm
radical.
straight. Why do I keep getting all this gay content? And so what am I telling the algorithm that I don't know? Okay, we need to go quicker here. We got two more sections. Human agency and liberty is the next section. No AI personhood. AI systems must not be granted legal personhood, and AI systems should not be designed such that they deserve personhood. We're going to come back to that. Trustworthiness. AI must be transparent, accountable, reliable, and free from perverse, private, or authoritarian interests like that. Liberty. AI must not curtail individual liberty, freedom of speech, religious practice, or association. Data rights and privacy. People should have power over their personal data with rights to access, correct, and delete it from active systems, training sets, and derived inferences. So a right to opt out. AI should not be allowed to exploit data about mental or emotional states of users. We'll come back to that one in a second. But AI systems, avoiding enfeeblement. AI systems should be designed to empower rather than feeble their users. Okay, so working backwards. Cognitive outsourcing is a form of enfeeblement. It seems inescapable with the use of these systems. So I'm not sure how we design them to empower necessarily rather than enfeeble. Psychological privacy. All AI systems are trying to figure out your emotional state so they know how to communicate with you best and satisfy you best. So I don't know what it means for them not to be able to discern or exploit our emotional states. And then back to AI personhood. This is the most complicated one, I think. AI systems must not be granted legal personhood, okay, ever. And AI systems should not be designed such that they deserve personhood. Okay, well, the second part says you think that they could be designed or could accidentally achieve something where they would deserve personhood. Well, when they get personhood, when they deserve personhood, don't you think they should get personhood, right? So, how can you say they must not be granted personhood and then say they could have personhood?
That, I mean, is extremely confusing to me, that those two clauses, but it almost sounds like a quite it's a quite circular argument, and it almost sounds like someone traveled back in time to write this. But I don't know what it means to deserve personhood. I think I don't I'm not really comfortable with the phrasing in general that I mean that sounds like it's like straight out of racial capitalism or something. You know, should these debates about personhood almost always centered around slavery and other and now with prisons, right? I mean, does a person in prison deserve personhood? No, they don't really explicitly say that, but I mean, policies and practices show that, well, the government and large numbers of people don't believe that anyone who is convicted of a crime actually should be treated as a full person.
Yeah, just back to your slavery parallel. This is like saying slaves must never be given citizenship, and you should never own a slave that deserves citizenship.
That is exactly what they did say for
Yeah.
hundreds of years.
Yeah.
And so I'm just really not comfortable with that at all. Like, I'm not saying again that, you know, I don't know that a machine is capable of personhood.
Yeah.
I have serious doubts on like ontological grounds that that is possible. And so I don't I don't think that it will happen. I don't know that it will happen.
I think
I
that's an
don't want to get
interesting
into the
point
debate about it, but
because
I do
if we
think
were to survey people who self-identified as techno progressives, My suspicion is that 90% of them would say that they think AI personhood is eventually going to be achievable. And there's going to be people who think that it'll skip over personhood, or there'll be people who think that it'll be something weirder than personhood or something like that. But 90% of them, I think, would think that AGI would eventually be achievable. And then the question is, have we got it yet? How will we know? What do we do when we get there? Things like that. But you're saying you don't think it's ever going to be possible, something that constitutes AI personhood, or it's not here yet.
Well, I honestly have no idea.
Okay.
But that being said, I can see why, theoretically it is possible. I follow the debates about consciousness and about personhood, and well, what really fundamentally separates, humans and living beings from any other object in the universe. And we don't really know. So we don't actually know why we're conscious, what consciousness is, why we have a perspective. There's lots of theories about it. Some people say it's the most important thing ever. Other people say it's just a mistake and has no real meaning. It's a made-up problem. And I'm not an expert in consciousness, so I don't have like a high stakes position on it. I think it's probably not something so extreme on those ends. Like doesn't matter at all, and it's just a mistake. And on the other hand, it's like the center of all meaning in the universe. No, not even just meaning in the universe. Of course, meaning is something that has to have consciousness, I think, but that it's the universe is like organized around consciousness. People have made this argument. Also, not just on like new age or spiritual grounds, but also people have tried to prove this scientifically. I don't know how we could prove it. It'd be very difficult, I think, to know if a being is actually experiencing a perspective rather than just seeming to experience a perspective. People in the past have argued, right? Turing argued, and others have argued that, well, when something appears conscious, then it must be conscious. Now we know chatbots seem pretty conscious. When you're talking to them, they sound like real people half the time. They only
But
kind of a little bit give themselves away, but we know they're not conscious, and that's very unlikely. So how would we know? I'm not sure. But is it theoretically possible? We're conscious. I don't think that, everybody except me is an NPC like Elon Musk does, but you know, I can't prove that other people are conscious, right? Nobody can. We can
and
only just see the effects.
the people that I pay attention to who think about this are, I think, mostly functionalists in the sense that they think consciousness is an ensemble of various skills that our brains have evolved over time. And one of those skills is natural language processing, which we've cracked. And we've got LLMs that can do that really, really well and do some functions of the reasoning parts of our brain as well. But there's a whole architecture of other things that our brains do, functions that are not yet being done as a part of AI. And that until those things are done, it won't begin to approximate human-like behavior, if even we want it to. Once we get those things, it may not even be human-like behavior then. But things like having the common sense about how to navigate a three-dimensional environment would take training it on three-dimensional environments until it builds up the same kind of understanding of three-dimensionality that we have by being children, and other kinds of common sense about the world, which are all the unstated things that they don't know. So, I think that kind of functionalism makes a lot of sense to me, but it's not an argument against against our AI personhood. It's just an argument that LLMs have AI personhood. The idea that we could do LLMization to all those other functions of the brain and eventually get them all plugged together, I think it makes a lot of sense to me. Is that not something that you believe?
I wouldn't say it's not something I believe. I think I can I can see in theory why it is possible for, you know, a non-organic being to be like to become conscious. Whether or not it will happen, I'm not sure.
No one
Actually,
is. Yeah. No,
yeah,
yeah.
I mean, it's very difficult to like actually understand where that line is. And like, is it just some kind of threshold? Like, I don't know. I mean, when did living beings become conscious and have a perspective? I mean, we could say, well, it was the Cambrian explosion, and but why? Like, why did it just like it's a very mysterious thing, like why we became conscious, I think. And
I
um,
I would say it goes back to what they defined at the top, which is the kind of behavior of a superintelligence that they want to avoid, are the desire for self perpetuation, the desire to deceive in order to perpetuate your own existence, and things like that. Um, but those are not defining characteristics of personhood necessarily. They're defining characteristics of agentic behavior. And a paramecium has agentic behavior. So for me, this goes back to citizen cyborg questions of what is the great scale of being along which we want to say, okay, at this point we care about your suffering, and at this point we care about your personhood and your citizenship and your rights as a member of our society. I think we can say we don't want super intelligences acting like paramecia and gobbling other things up and trying to perpetuate their own existence. And we definitely don't want them acting like human beings yet. But if we ever saw one that acted like a human being, it should be granted rights. That's where I'm at with it all.
well, yeah, I mean, I think we do not want to not grant any being rights that, can feel injustice, right? That would like
We do not want
that's
to
like
deny rights to a being that can feel
that's
injustice.
that's what I meant.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yes. The like that just like reproduces the historical problems that humans are still, again, doing to other groups of people, like not only in prisons, but right now in Iran and in Israel and other places. Like these people are less have less personhood than us because they're not in our society, and therefore we can treat them as, you know, they exist only in relation to us and our interests and not as separate autonomous beings. And I think that is something we don't want to reproduce.
Let's just pause for a second because I think we can specify it better than injustice. I like injustice for the ability to experience injustice, but I think injustice is a general category or is a part of a general category of a being has plans and intents over time that
Hmm.
they think are essential for their happiness and their flourishing. And you have imposed unwarranted restrictions on them, right? So you're
Right.
any restriction on them. And injustice is a kind of abstract version of restrictions placed on our personal freedoms and flourishing, right? So I think it gets back to this original point that they make. It's like we don't want a system that has plans and intents over time, right? We want
Right.
it to only be responsive to our plans and intents. If it has its own plans and intents, there's a problem. And I'm saying,
Yes.
oh, yes, there is a
So
problem.
we
Let's
want to limit its development.
right,
We want
exactly.
to pause if there is this threshold, we want that threshold, we want to be under that threshold, and we want to always be under that threshold,
Right.
right? Indefinitely. We don't know where that threshold is, right? That's the biggest problem. We don't know where that threshold is. We have no idea when we're going to cross it. We'll only know after we've already crossed it, and probably long after we crossed it.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, we're going to have a
how would
hard
we
enough time distinguishing the fake crossings from the real crossings because we're going
that
to have all
is
kinds of type 2 errors here.
that I think is like an enormous problem that we already, yeah, we already have, right? We already have that problem. Right. So then we're saying, well, like, is part of the declaration that we need to stop and either like invent and we have to solve like the hard problem of consciousness and be able to like determine who is conscious, and like we can't proceed until we know the answer to that question, which may not be possible without super intelligent AI. Uh,
I mean,
and
I know that this question did not escape some of the participants here because there were academics in attendance who've written explicitly about that topic.
it
But
was at Chalmers, right? That's like his main question, like
yeah,
about the hard problem of consciousness. And I And of course, then there's people who say there's no such thing. That's just made up to
Yeah.
sell
People at
philosophy.
this meeting were Joshua Bengio, Stuart Russell. Both of them have clear. Jaron Lanier, he's opposed to any kind of AI consciousness talk. Meredith
Mm,
Whitaker from Signal.
yep.
So there were people who definitely could have done better on the AI personhood or more specific, but anything more specific, and you would have lost the coalition, I think, because
But I do think the coalition breaks down way before that. Like if you
yeah,
just these principles here on data rights and privacy and on psychological privacy, right, that you're saying, like first those are paired together. Anything
yeah.
related to data and democratizing data like breaks the Silicon Valley model. You cannot really have people controlling their own data and controlling where it goes and how it is used if you want to have, techno capitalism. Like,
Right. Well, this is a point I've been making is that if you apply Cory Doctorow's adversarial interoperability to the AI agent future, then you have to say, and anything I do with Claude or with OpenAI, and actually they're not too far away from this because I just did it. I switched from OpenAI to Claude. So I asked Gemini what the best way to do it was. And Gemini said, well, you can tell Claude to generate this very specific document. Or no, maybe I asked Claude. But anyway, it said, generate this very specific document and upload that document to me. And that document will be a description of every interaction you ever had with Claude, with OpenAI. And Claude then will take that and incorporate that learning into its own personal model of who you are. So I
that's
did
very,
that, right? And I consider that to be an example of this adversarial interoperability. It's like I'm sure that all of those companies would prefer that all the learnings that I had with OpenAI would be stuck in OpenAI, so I would be stuck in OpenAI,
right.
right? So that's, but at any rate, okay. The final section of this document: responsibility and accountability for AI companies. No liability shield. AI
Mm,
must not be able to act as a liability shield, preventing those deploying it from being legally responsible for their actions, obviously. Developer liability. Developers and deployers bear legal liability for defects, misrepresentation of capabilities, and inadequate safety controls, with statutes of limitation that account for harms emerging over time. I don't think I have a problem with that, but I have to think about it. Personal liability, there should be criminal penalties for executives responsible for prohibited child targeted systems or ones causing catastrophic harm. So, personal liability of executives. I'm fine
yeah,
with that. Independent
sure.
safety standards. AI development should be governed by independent safety standards. We've already said yes, please. No regulatory capture. All AI companies must not be allowed to undue influence over rules that govern them. Yes, obviously. Failure transparency. If an AI system causes harm, it should be possible to ascertain why, as well as who is responsible. Complicated. AI loyalty. AI systems performing functions in professions. I think this one's really interesting. AI systems performing functions in professions with fiduciary duties, such as health, finance, law, or therapy, must fulfill all of those duties, including mandated reporting, duty of care, conflict of interest disclosure, and informed consent. Now, this one I think is really interesting because, just to give you some history, when I was working at the University of Chicago Hospital 35 years ago, I said, look, if a patient has a do not resuscitate order, maybe the automated record keeping system that the nurses use should not even give them a box to check whether they were resuscitated or not, because they shouldn't have been resuscitated. If there's no DNR, there shouldn't even be a box there saying I resuscitated them or not. And people were like, "Oh no, you can't possibly do that." They didn't want a system to be overriding, on the basis of what those responsibilities were. The responsibilities respect to DNR, not to ignore it when you feel like it. But they were like, "No, no, no, we can't do that." But in terms of mandated reporting, so if an AI healthcare system, if you were talking to an AI healthcare system and you expressed suicidal ideation, and you were doing that with a priest or a healthcare worker, they would at some point have an obligation to do something.
Right.
And what this is saying is that they want the AIs to have the same obligation.
Yeah. Well, that goes back to that problem of the AI, I guess it was chat. I think it was ChatGPT writing a suicide note.
Yeah.
And there
And
was
saying
nothing
that,
in,
yeah, don't leave the noose out. so that your parents can see it. There's all these kind of fucked up communications.
Yeah, and there was no flagging, nothing in there. And I agree, that's a big problem. And I can see a
That's the
very
reverse. I mean, that's it was enabling suicide. But
yeah.
we're just I'm just talking about would if you were talking to a healthcare AI and it suddenly sent a message to the cops saying we think you need to come and talk to this guy, I would be pretty upset, right? But they're saying that it should be built into these systems that they do the same thing as a lawyer or a doctor would.
Well, yeah, I mean, something like, flagging it as needing the intervention of a therapist or some other medical professional, that it makes sense. But there are some problems, I think, that can arise from these kinds of systems. Not in that specific instance, perhaps. Obviously, there could be false positives and such that also happens in human systems. But I think the other more troubling thing would be like if your parents could have, right, going back to the family and parents thing, like if you talk about something related to gender identity or you talk about some experience like
Right.
you had a sexual experience and you're under 18.
Well, again,
uh
the age gating could come in here. It's like everybody under 18 talking to these systems. It could
couldn't
be
you
sending
incriminate yourself and other people doing that? Like I think
right, and it could
it's
be sending
technically
messages
illegal.
to your parents. So
It's technically illegal to like have sex under the age of consent, right?
right,
Even if that other person is under the age, which is first of all totally normal, happens all the time. It's not necessarily, it's not something like, I would suggest advocating for.
yeah, don't want to
But
make it mandatory, but
do we want to be policing kids this way? I think that many people argue that we should. And there are people in parents' rights groups and other things that have all long advocated for that, that we need to be surveilling kids. We need to make sure that they can't, you know,
it's
use.
it's funny because John Haidt, one of his big complaints is that kids need more unsupervised play.
Yeah.
And here the Luddite push is, yeah, but we want their AIs to be watching them at all times and reporting back to their parents and the cops if necessary.
Well, there's just a lot of stuff that, young people do that, we would say is questionable, maybe not a good idea. And, we're both parents. We don't want our kids to do things, or, your kids are much older than mine, but when they were young, like, we don't want them to do all kinds of stuff. But, these systems can be, uh, first, they put a lot of pressure, I think, on like, now, if it's possible, aren't you obligated to use it now in a way, right? Like this is one of the other problems. I think this is a somewhat of a Luddite argument, but since they're using it as a pro AI, almost as a pro AI argument for surveillance, I'll bring it up in on technoprogressive grounds, which is that like if we have the ability to surveil, aren't we in some way responsible? Would that be irresponsible to not do it? Like,
Right.
what if your kids get pregnant? What if like they get STIs? What if they go in and, start drinking or experimenting with drugs? And you could have prevented this by if your kid was talking about what the effects of, Molly are, then it notifies you as a parent so they're considering, taking ecstasy, right?
Right.
Like,
We either
okay,
do have
sure.
CCT cameras everywhere or we don't. But if we're going to have CCT cameras everywhere, the AI watching stuff should not only flag theft, it should also flag rape and other crimes, right? So it's like let's at least examine what we're surveilling here. But in terms of the liability shield, I think the liability shield stuff is very interesting because I agree that no AI should be held liable right now for any crimes, and that there should be corporate liability. That the company that makes and distributes and uses these things should be the target of liability claims. And I think there's an argument for executive liability, but the corporate liability is like if you're a factory worker and you don't screw on a screw and it was your fault that you didn't screw on the screw and that car falls apart and kills somebody, they don't sue you, they sue the company.
Right.
Both because the company has the bucks but also because it was the company's responsibility to make sure you didn't do that. even though you are a person, right? Even though you could be sued. We have
Mhm.
decided as a society that that doesn't make sense. Now, the individual who could be held liable is not you, but the boss at the top, because they made the decisions, right? You could say legitimately, you can legitimately use the Nuremberg defense. I was following orders. I was just working here. It was their responsibility to see that I made a mistake. Um, but the guy at the top doesn't have that excuse, so the buck stops with them. So that's where you send the generals to prison and you leave the soldiers alone in the Nuremberg defense. Um, so I see these as very consistent with previous ideas about liability, and I'm fine with what they've done here. Do you feel the same way?
I think that makes sense, in the terms in the situation where you have workers on an assembly line making mistakes, the company maybe is liable because they didn't put enough investment into quality control,
Right.
right? So you would say, well, if an individual that's a programmer is experimenting and put some kind of code in that the company doesn't, well, that the company ostensibly says they don't like, but then you don't check the code and you don't have any system for determining what should be pushed out into the live system, that is really not something that I think should fall on an individual worker. I mean, even in terms of malicious, even in terms of malicious ad additions to code, I don't think that it should fall directly on them unless they were, working in some kind of conspiracy. There are instances where it makes sense, but in most cases, I think it would probably be a mistake, or it would probably be something like they, unintended consequences, and we can't all know the consequences of our actions. I think it's extremely difficult. I know in your talk with David, he brought that up. Like, we don't all know what our technologies are going to do. He had mentioned like about cell phones. We didn't know that, 9-year-olds were going to be using them. Everybody was thinking of adults because only adults owned phones before, and we didn't
Mm-hmm.
know that when they got cheaper, and then people would start giving them to kids, and then there are all these effects. Um, and in that case too, it's a similar kind of thing. Like, should the harms of using technology fall on the parents? Should it fall on phone makers, on software, on like the developers of apps? And it depends. Like, if you are developing apps specifically to, target children, this is very similar to like advertising. They use like specifically, target children,
Right.
and they still do, of course. But you, if your app is specifically designed to draw a child into a certain behavior that is known to be harmful, right? You should have liability, not parents who may not know what that app does, right? Not everybody knows what every app does. And so you may be like, yeah, well, all the kids at school are using this app. It must be fine.
Right.
So my kid is
I
using this
don't
app.
understand the restriction on apps that are trying to get information from kids and manipulate them. I don't understand where that restriction would start, because as soon as you have an algorithm that says I'm going to pay attention to what this person's doing and try to give them more of what they like, aren't you already on that path, right? So if the kid says, I like Blue's Clues, oh, if you like Blue's Clues, you probably also like Clifford the big dog or whatever.
Sure.
Isn't that an algorithmic recommendation that's going to keep them on the platform more and exploiting the information about them? So I don't know where it stops.
Well, that is a difficult question, and I don't know where we should make the line, but I do know that, there are many instances where platforms expose kids to pretty unacceptable harms. I think, Grok creating CSAM is like something that they should be held liable for, and they're not being held liable for at X. And it's probably because Elon Musk is connected to the government and other things, and because it makes a lot of money. But the, what's the other one? What's that racing game that kids play? Um,
Got me, babe. I know
uh,
nothing about sports,
oh,
especially
Roblox.
Roblox. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, like Roblox, there's like been numerous cases of adults going on and like just doing all kinds of really terrible, abusive things.
Yeah.
And the platform having knowledge
Predatory
of
behavior.
this
Yeah.
predatory behavior and the platform knowing about this, having complaints made and having users not be kicked off the platform when this person, for many people actually, it's like a whole problem, are known to be engaging in predatory behavior on their platform. They should be held liable if they're, in each individual parent isn't going to know, right? Like I know about it because I study tech, but like many parents have no idea that, oh, they're like, oh, all your friends are on Roblox. Like it seems like a perfectly harmless thing to do. Everyone is doing it. Okay. That's like,
My my
as
son
a kid, I played Mario.
my son when he was like 10 was big into Minecraft, which is like Roblox. And he said at one point to me, Dad, I logged on the other day and I just told it I was a girl and I got 10 times as many offers of free gifts from the other players as when I log in as a boy. And I'm like, oh, okay, let's talk about this. But yeah, it happens. Um,
Yeah.
okay. Uh, I think one of the really interesting things about this document is, and if you go to, again, the document we're talking about is called the Pro-Human AI Declaration, and it's at humanstatement.org. But one of the really interesting things is that the AFL-CIO Tech Institute was a co-signer of the document, and presumably the AFL in general is an endorser of this document. And they came up with their own concurring opinion, but laying out their own 10 pro-worker AI innovations, which dovetails Darren Asimoglu, who were and David Autor, both at this meeting, but they had also just published a paper on pro-worker AI regulation. So I
Right.
think it's dovetailing with that. But the kinds of things that they talk about in that is strengthening labor rights and broaden opportunities for collective bargaining, advance guardrails against harmful uses in the workplace, support and promote copyright and intellectual property protections, develop a worker-centered workforce training system for AI, or I guess in response to AI, institutionalize worker voice within AI R&D, require transparency and accountability. So kind of reiterations, but specifically focused on the workplace and workers for a lot of the things that were talked about in the document. And I really like that they did that. And I think it's fantastic step forward.
Yeah. It is I read some of that and it's a very interesting document. Maybe we can have a whole separate conversation about it.
I think we
But
should have a conversation about the pro worker AI idea,
yeah,
like whether we think endorsing taxation shifts from corporate taxes that benefit capital expenditures to ones that benefit investment in labor. That's one of the things Auteur and Asimoglu argued for.
yeah, and I think that's it reopens a long debate about automation and like that it's not a monolith, right? The debates back in the 60s and 70s around automation brought up a lot of these points that there is automation from the top where it's really organized around the idea of operational autonomy by management, and that automation is primarily reinforcing the division of labor between, the mental and manual division of labor between managers and the shareholders having control over the process and workers doing kind of what they're told. And that automation is to exacerbate that divide to make sure that workers are even more cogs in the machine and that they are a ever more efficient cog in the machine. And many labor unions at that time brought up the fact that, well, that's one way of doing automation that in maybe increases stock prices because then management and shareholders can say, well, this reduces the chance of labor actions and strikes and other things. And it allows for more control from the top. It allows us to say something and then it gets done more effectively. It's a more efficient sort of power relationship in that way. It's a more complete power relationship. And many workers in unions, and there was a whole scholarship around labor process theory in the 70s, and which was part of the automation debates during that time. around industrial automation and industrial robotics, but it applies here in I think in an even more pointed way. And they argue that, well, there's also automation from the bottom. Like if we control automation, we know the process better than anybody else. If we devolve power from the top and we reduce the top heaviness of a corporation, if we reduce the layers of control, then instead of automating labor, we can automate management. We
Mhm.
can automate the process of connecting different parts of the labor process together and enabling workers to have more control over the process. And we can do better at reducing the costs and increasing productivity because we know the process best.
Mhm.
And so that is a pro worker theory. And there were lots of books written on this in the 70s. And I think in the United Auto Workers put out a whole thing about it back then. And they were like, well, you're going to inevitably make a ton of mistakes because you don't actually know the all the details that go into the process of making anything. You're doing everything on paper. You're doing it from afar. We are doing it every day and we know every single detail. And so it really makes most sense for us to have that control and to control it at the shop floor level. And I think the same thing could be said of digital technologies. And that debate was never really fully settled. I know obviously it did eventually, because of the crises in the 70s, obviously all of the weight moved against unions and then they did automate on behalf of management. It's not
Well,
determined whether or not that was actually more efficient and more productive or whether there could have been an alternative. And I think we should really maybe emerge that debate.
I think the evidence about 21st century or 20th century worker self management was that there were, in fact, some skills and roles or some things that managers do that need to be done, and there's a market for people who know how to do those things and can do them well. So there was, I think that the industrial sociology never really validated the notion of a completely headless, acephalous workplace, because we didn't have the mechanisms yet for completely decentralized managerial decision making. But I think that's one of the promises of AI in the workplace is not that it does in fact give managers the ability to eliminate intermediary levels of supervision and communicate directly with the base, but it also gives the base the ability to communicate with each other in new ways and to control even replace, as you say, the top. So I think that's again, for a techno-progressive labor theory, we should be thinking about, well, as we try to shrink work, how do we change the structures of work? And as I've mentioned for the interview I did with David Shapiro, one of the things that Shapiro's now arguing for is employee ownership plans, and so they
Yeah.
kind of having the cooperativization of the economy proceed along with the changes that artificial intelligence will wring from us. I think
Yeah,
we,
absolutely.
yeah, absolutely.
I think that there's a very good, just to close out on that, like I think, there's been lots of studies on how much more effective and productive cooperatives are, and much of the problems come about when you have larger institutions where you have different departments and different types of labor that need to interact, and that's where you need those intermediaries. And when you have to deal with the scaling of an economy at the, regional, national, international level, then you have these problems of moving information from the very bottom, like moving fine grain information into something that can translate across many borders. And I think that's something that we could deal with in a more automated system in a way that enables like a fuller development of labor, reduces its intensity on individual workers, right? Shortening work hours, shortening work week, reducing the kind of superfluous make work and other kind of tedious work, but enabling a more effective information economy. Like clearly the highest value information is going to be the closest to the process itself, right? Like there's just no way that people far away from the process are going to know more from the people who do it every day. So, maybe for a long time, this was a big problem because when we thought about something, in anarchist theory, for instance, or like, in libertarian socialism, where they're thinking of committees of workers, and then you delegate upward into a confederacy and a federation of different committees, and those federations talk to the federations in other countries, and you have a global government that's decentralized. And in theory, that sounds excellent, but it's very difficult to do in practice because information degrades as it gets further away from the process. And sometimes you have whole nations just because of the way geography is set up that are doing a process that's like, well, there's only a few places on Earth where there's a lot of cobalt. And so the workers that are dealing with that cobalt are going to know a lot about it. And people in other countries that have no cobalt are not going to know that much about it. So how do we deal with those problems in information? And how do we translate that so that, you know, different parts of the supply chain, which are actually just people working, can interact and communicate with each other in a rich way without losing too much to where it just makes more sense to control it in a centralized top-down manner the way it is now, right? So I think that's something we can maybe open up a debate about and talk about more fully.
Fantastic. So as I have mentioned several times, I did interview the public intellectual David Shapiro about post-labor economics. That'll be coming out shortly. What do you have planned for Bread and Robots, Matteo?
Yeah, I would like to talk to this guy. I mentioned him to you. I sent an email. What's his name here? Actually, I have it here. Brandon King from Minnesota House District 20A. He has a really interesting
He's popped up
platform.
on my radar too.
Yeah, he sent me he actually commented on one of my videos, the one that I did with AFT Technoprog, and he was talking about the Workforce Liberation Act and like the Housing Sovereignty Act and making technologies that reduce the cost of housing, democratize like 3D printing housing and producing houses at cost, and injecting a lot of techno-progressive policies into a democratic socialist vision, right? Like maximizing techno-progressivism in the Progressive Project, which I found very interesting. And I think I'm going to set up a meeting with him in the next, maybe in the next week or two.
Well, I've been emailing you and Eli, about our thoughts about techno-progressive politicians in the United States, and we're also looking at other countries. We've recently got some interesting leads on UK Greens who might have
Yeah.
techno-progressive orientations, and of course, lots of European folks. So I think I want to work my way up to Ro Khanna. I think he's, for me, Ro Khanna is probably the most techno-progressive presidential level aspirant at this point. And but I'm not sure, even with the Democrats newly attuned to the need to get on every podcast, I'm not sure we're at the level. We're not at Joe Rogan's level yet, so we'll have to see.
Yeah, we're working on it.
Yeah. Okay, man. It's been a delight talking to you about this, and hang in there.
Yeah, thanks, James.
The Techno Progressive Hub is sponsored by the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies and hosted by me, Jay Hughes. Find us at Substack at Techno Progressives.